In the grand and terrible tapestry of human history, few conflicts loom as large or as devastating as the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet Union's titanic struggle against Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front of World War II. It was a war of annihilation, a clash of ideologies fought on an incomprehensible scale, where the destiny of nations was forged in the fires of cities like Stalingrad and Kursk. This victory, so absolute and so costly, was built upon the blood and sacrifice of millions of Soviet citizens. Yet such a monumental effort could never have succeeded without the guiding hands of military genius. When history recalls the titans of the Red Army, one name invariably rises to the fore: Georgy Zhukov. He was the indomitable Marshal of Victory, the iron-willed troubleshooter, the embodiment of Soviet resilience and offensive power. Hagiographers and historians alike have rightfully celebrated him as Stalin's right hand, the man who commanded the armies that broke the back of the Wehrmacht from the gates of Moscow to the ruins of Berlin. But a body cannot function with only one hand. If Zhukov was the sledgehammer that shattered German defenses, there was another, quieter, more cerebral force who designed the intricate machinery of that victory. This was Stalin's left hand, a man whose name, while revered by military professionals, often rests in the shadow of his more famous colleague. He was the brilliant strategist who night after night alongside Zhukov meticulously drafted the blueprints for the Red Army's greatest triumphs. He was the architect who designed the grand traps and sweeping offensives that would change the course of the war. His name was Aleksandr Mikhailovich Vasilevsky. Vasilevsky's life in uniform was a journey through the most tumultuous period in Russian history. His career began in the twilight of the Tsarist Empire, was reforged in the crucible of the Bolshevik Revolution and the Russian Civil War, and culminated in his rise to the highest echelons of the Red Army. He was not a frontline brawler, but a master of the operational art, a quiet professional whose genius lay in logistics, planning, and the grand strategic vision. From the desperate defense of Moscow to the masterful encirclement at Stalingrad and the lightning campaign in Manchuria, Vasilevsky's mind was the silent, indispensable weapon that ensured the triumph of the Soviet cause. This is the story of that architect, the quiet marshal whose brilliance was the cornerstone of the victory that saved the world from Nazism.
Alexander Vasilevsky's path to becoming a Marshal of the Soviet Union was anything but preordained. Born in 1895 in a small village, he was the son of a Russian Orthodox priest, a background that, in the fiercely atheistic Soviet state, could have been a career-ending liability. His early life was one of scholarship and faith, and he initially planned to become an agronomist or a surveyor. The outbreak of World War I, however, irrevocably altered his destiny. Caught up in a wave of patriotic fervor, he entered the Alexeyevskoye Military Law Academy and was commissioned as an officer in the Imperial Russian Army. He served with distinction on the Southwestern Front, rising to the rank of staff captain and commanding a battalion. Here, in the bloody trenches of the Great War, he learned the brutal fundamentals of modern warfare, the importance of supply, the horror of attrition, and the necessity of sound leadership. When the Russian Revolution erupted in 1917, Vasilevsky, like many officers of the old army, faced a difficult choice. After a brief period away from the military, he enlisted in the newly formed Red Army in 1919, dedicating himself to the Bolshevik cause. His service during the Russian Civil War and the subsequent Polish-Soviet War was not in the glamorous cavalry charges of Budyonny or the frontline heroics of others who would later become famous. Instead, Vasilevsky found his calling in the meticulous, thankless, yet utterly vital world of staff work. His superiors quickly recognized his exceptional intellect, his calm demeanor under pressure, and his unparalleled ability to organize and plan complex military operations. He was a natural at poring over maps, calculating logistical requirements, and translating broad strategic goals into concrete orders for thousands of men. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, as the Red Army modernized, Vasilevsky quietly rose through the ranks of the staff. He was a student of the emerging Soviet doctrine of deep battle, a revolutionary concept that emphasized combined arms operations with massed tank formations and air power breaking through enemy lines to strike deep into the operational rear, encircling and destroying entire armies. While others like Mikhail Tukhachevsky were the public faces of this new doctrine, Vasilevsky was one of the men in the back rooms mastering its intricate mechanics. His survival and promotion during Stalin's Great Purge of the late 1930s, which decapitated the Red Army's officer corps, is a testament to his character. While brilliant, charismatic, and potentially threatening commanders like Tukhachevsky were executed on trumped-up charges, Vasilevsky was seen as the consummate professional, apolitical, diligent, and indispensable. His focus was on his work, not on politics or self-aggrandizement. This quiet competence saved his life and positioned him within the general staff, the Stavka, just as the world was about to plunge into its deadliest conflict. By 1941, as the shadow of the swastika fell across Europe, Major General Vasilevsky was serving as the Deputy Chief of the Operations Directorate, a pivotal position at the very heart of the Soviet military nervous system. The quiet priest's son was about to become the architect of its salvation.
While Vasilevsky's contributions during the desperate defense of Moscow in 1941 were crucial, working tirelessly within the Stavka to manage the flow of reserves and stabilize the collapsing front, it was at Stalingrad that his genius was truly unleashed on the world stage. Following their staggering defeat at Moscow, Hitler and the German High Command, OKW, shifted their strategic focus for the summer of 1942. Recognizing that a direct assault on the Soviet capital was no longer feasible, they launched Case Blue, a massive offensive aimed at the south. The objectives were twofold. First, to seize the rich oil fields of the Caucasus, which would fuel the German war machine and cripple the Soviet economy. Second, to capture the city of Stalingrad. More than just an industrial hub on the Volga River, Stalingrad bore Stalin's name, and its capture would be a devastating psychological blow to the Soviet Union. In the initial stages of Case Blue were a catastrophic success for the Germans. The Wehrmacht's Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, and the Fourth Panzer Army smashed through ill-prepared Soviet defenses. The southwestern front collapsed, and the road to Stalingrad and the Caucasus lay open. Panic rippled through the Soviet command. It was in this moment of supreme crisis that Stalin dispatched Vasilevsky to the southern front as the Stavka's representative. This marked his first time in supreme command of a large-scale multi-front operation. The fate of the Soviet South rested on his shoulders. With a cool head, Vasilevsky immediately began to impose order on the chaos. His first task was to orchestrate a fighting withdrawal, saving what units he could from encirclement while simultaneously constructing new defensive lines. He displayed an extraordinary talent for defensive warfare, a field often overlooked in the Red Army's offensive-minded doctrine. He understood that a simple brittle defense would shatter. Instead, he implemented a defense in depth, turning every building, every factory, and every pile of rubble in Stalingrad into a fortress. The city became a meat grinder, a rat war, as its defender, General Vasily Zhukov, called it. As Paulus's Sixth Army became bogged down in the brutal urban combat, Vasilevsky, in constant communication with Zhukov and Stalin, began to see the German obsession with the city not as a threat, but as an opportunity. The Germans had poured their best troops into the city itself, leaving their vast flanks, stretching for hundreds of kilometers, to be guarded by their weaker and less equipped Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian allies. This was the enemy's critical vulnerability, the Achilles heel of the entire southern campaign. In the autumn of 1942, Vasilevsky and Zhukov became a perfect synthesis of military talent. Day and night they worked together, sketching out one of the most brilliant and audacious counteroffensives in military history. Zhukov, the master of the offensive blow, helped conceive the raw power of the attack.
Vasilevsky, the meticulous architect, planned every detail. The secret massing of over 1 million men, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, the complex logistics of supplying these massive new armies, and the precise timing of the assault. The plan was codenamed Operation Uranus. The concept was a classic double envelopment, a pincer movement on a colossal scale. Two powerful Soviet fronts would smash through the weak Romanian positions to the north and south of Stalingrad. These two armored spearheads would then race across the frozen steppe to meet at the town of Kalach-na-Donu, deep in the German rear, thereby trapping the entire Sixth Army and parts of the 4th Panzer Army in a massive pocket, or kessel. On November 19, 1922, after a thunderous artillery barrage, Operation Uranus was launched. The Romanian lines disintegrated almost instantly. The Soviet T-34 tanks poured through the gaps, advancing with stunning speed. Within 4 days, the pincers closed at Kalach. In the heart of the cauldron, some 330,000 Axis soldiers were trapped. The hunter had become the hunted. In Berlin, Hitler flew into a rage and forbade Paulus from attempting a breakout. He promised the Sixth Army they would be supplied by air and relieved. To lead the relief effort, he dispatched his most brilliant field marshal, Erich von Manstein, with a hastily assembled force codenamed Operation Winter Storm. Manstein's panzer divisions struck from the south, aiming to punch a corridor to the trapped army. For a moment, it seemed they might succeed. This was Vasilevsky's finest hour. While Zhukov was occupied with another operation to the north, Vasilevsky was in sole command of the effort to contain the Stalingrad pocket and, crucially, to defeat Manstein's relief attempt. He masterfully shifted reserves, organized a rock-solid defense, and launched a counterattack, Operation Little Saturn, that struck at the flank of Manstein's force, threatening to encircle the rescuers themselves. Manstein was stopped dead in his tracks, just 30 miles from the pocket. The fate of the Sixth Army was sealed. With all hope of rescue gone, the starving, frozen remnants of Paulus's army were systematically destroyed. On February 2, 1943, they surrendered. The victory at Stalingrad was more than just a battle won. It was the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and put the Soviet Union on the long, bloody road to Berlin. For Vasilevsky, it was a triumph that catapulted him out of the shadows and onto the world stage, marking him as a military strategist of the First Order. His plan had not just defeated an army, it had annihilated it. As the war in Europe thundered to its conclusion in the spring of 1945, another conflict still raged across the Pacific. At the Yalta Conference in February, Stalin had pledged to the Allies that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Imperial Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. This was a promise with enormous strategic implications, aimed at pinning down Japan's elite Kwantung Army in Manchuria and solidifying Soviet influence in post-war Asia. The man chosen to orchestrate this final colossal campaign was Aleksandr Vasilevsky. Appointed Supreme Commander of Soviet forces in the Far East, Vasilevsky was tasked with planning and executing what would become Operation August Storm. The challenge was immense. The Kwantung Army was a formidable, battle-hardened force of over 1 million men, deeply entrenched in the fortified region of Manchuria, which the Japanese called Manchukuo. The terrain itself was a formidable enemy, a vast expanse of mountains, dense forests, and arid deserts. Vasilevsky approached the problem with the same meticulous analytical brilliance he had displayed at Stalingrad. For months, he oversaw one of the greatest logistical feats of the war. In near total secrecy, he moved over 1.5 million men, 5,000 tanks, nearly 30,000 artillery pieces, and almost 6,000 aircraft thousands of miles across the Trans-Siberian Railway. It was an entire front, complete with its supplies and equipment, transported across a continent without alerting Japanese intelligence. His strategic plan was a masterpiece of deep battle doctrine, a multi-pronged blitzkrieg designed to overwhelm and disorient the enemy from all directions. It was even more ambitious than Operation Uranus. 3 massive army groups, fronts, would attack simultaneously. The Trans-Baikal Front would strike from the west, across the Gobi Desert and the Hingan Mountains, in a daring armored thrust aimed directly at the heart of Manchuria. The Second Far Eastern Front would attack from the north, down the line of the Amur and Ussuri rivers. The First Far Eastern Front would attack from the east, smashing through the heavily fortified Japanese border zones near Vladivostok. The goal was to execute a gigantic pincer movement on a scale covering over 800 kilometers, shattering the Kwantung Army and liberating Manchuria, northern Korea, and southern Sakhalin. He even incorporated a unique and effective ally, mobile cavalry units from the Mongolian People's Republic, who proved invaluable for reconnaissance and flanking maneuvers in the harsh terrain. On August 9, 1945, exactly 3 months after VE Day and just 2 days after the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, the Soviet Union officially declared war on Japan. Under the cover of a torrential summer storm, Vasilevsky's armies surged across the border. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. The speed, scale, and ferocity of the Soviet assault were overwhelming. The Western pincer, led by Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, achieved the seemingly impossible, driving its tanks and mechanized infantry across rugged mountain ranges that the Japanese had considered impassable. In the east, despite fanatical resistance from Japanese units in fortified bunkers, the Soviet forces broke through. Paratroopers were dropped on key cities like Harbin and Mukden to seize airfields and prevent the Japanese from regrouping or escaping. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of the Japanese military, simply disintegrated. Its command structure collapsed, its units were isolated and encircled, and its soldiers were either killed, captured, or in panicked retreat. The entire campaign was a stunning demonstration of combined arms warfare, executed with breathtaking precision. In less than 2 weeks, Vasilevsky's forces had accomplished all their primary objectives. They had advanced hundreds of kilometers, destroyed Japan's main land army, and effectively ended its control over the Asian mainland. The swift and total collapse of the Kwantung Army was a profound shock to the Japanese government in Tokyo. Many historians argue that the Soviet invasion was as decisive, if not more so, than the atomic bombings in compelling Emperor Hirohito to surrender. The prospect of a Soviet invasion of the Japanese home islands was a nightmare the leadership could not countenance. Operation August Storm was Vasilevsky's final and perhaps most perfect masterpiece. It was a flawless campaign studied in military academies to this day, a textbook example of strategic surprise, logistical excellence, and operational brilliance. It secured the Soviet Union's position as a major power in the Pacific and set the stage for the geopolitical landscape of the Cold War in Asia, including the division of Korea. For Vasilevsky, it was the triumphant capstone to a legendary wartime career.
Returning from the Far East, a national hero, twice decorated as a hero of the Soviet Union, Vasilevsky entered the complex and often treacherous world of post-war Soviet politics. It is here that the contrast between him and his famous colleague, Georgy Zhukov, is most stark. Zhukov, a charismatic and immensely popular figure, was perceived by the pathologically paranoid Stalin as a potential rival. His fame, stubborn independence, and willingness to take credit for victories made him a threat. Consequently, shortly after the war, Zhukov was unceremoniously demoted and exiled to obscure military posts, his star deliberately tarnished by the very leader he had served so loyally. The old disease of autocrats, fear of a general who's more popular than the master, had struck again. Vasilevsky, however, navigated these dangerous waters with consummate skill. His personality was the antithesis of Zhukov's. He was reserved, modest, and unfailingly professional. He never sought the limelight, always framing his achievements as the collective work of the Stavka and the Red Army. He understood the political realities of Stalin's court and never positioned himself as a public hero. This quiet competence and lack of political ambition made him appear non-threatening, and as a result, his career flourished. He was soon appointed Chief of the General Staff and later became the Minister of Defense of the USSR, a position he held during the critical early years of the Cold War. In this role, he oversaw the monumental task of demobilizing the massive Red Army, while simultaneously modernizing it for the nuclear age. He was instrumental in shaping Soviet military doctrine for the new era of bipolar conflict with the United States. Even after Stalin's death, Vasilevsky remained a respected elder statesman of the military. In 1973, he published his memoirs, The Cause of My Whole Life. True to his character, the book is a sober, professional account of the war, largely free of the self-aggrandizement that colored the memoirs of other commanders. He consistently gives credit to his colleagues, including Zhukov, and focuses on the strategic and operational details of the campaigns. In a famously humble gesture, he steadfastly refused to allow a biographical film to be made about him during his lifetime, believing his actions spoke for themselves. On December 5, 1977, the heart of the great Marshal finally stopped beating. In a tribute befitting his immense contributions to the nation, his ashes were interred in the Kremlin Wall necropolis on Red Square in Moscow, a final resting place for the most honored figures of the Soviet state. It was a quiet end for a quiet man, a final, silent period at the end of a life sentence written in victory.
Aleksandr Vasilevsky's place in the pantheon of great military commanders is secure, yet uniquely understated. He was not the archetypal warrior general leading charges from the front. He was something rarer, and, in the context of total industrial warfare, perhaps more important. He was a grand master of the military art, a strategist who saw the entire war as a single complex chessboard. His legacy is one of intellectual brilliance and quiet professionalism. At Stalingrad, he was the architect of the trap that broke the Wehrmacht's spine. In Manchuria, he conducted a campaign of such speed and elegance that it has been called the perfect battle. Throughout the war, he was the indispensable organizer and planner who translated broad strategic imperatives into workable, victorious operations on the ground. History rightly remembers Georgy Zhukov as the sword of the Red Army, sharp, powerful, and decisive. But it must also remember Aleksandr Vasilevsky as the mind that guided the sword's hand. He was the calm in the storm, the intellect behind the brute force, the architect who designed the blueprint of victory. Without his meticulous planning, his logistical genius, and his profound strategic vision, the Red Army's path to Berlin would have been far longer, far bloodier, and perhaps even impossible. He remains a titan of 20th century warfare, a testament to the fact that the greatest victories are won not only by the force of arms, but by the power of a brilliant and disciplined mind.